Picture this. You're scrolling through a social feed on a Tuesday afternoon.
Right, just a normal day.
Yeah, exactly. And you see a new campaign banner for your company. But it is completely, undeniably off-brand.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. Like, the font kerning is just weird. The tone is a little too aggressive.
The hex codes on the gradient are just a shade too bright.
Yes. And you just sit there thinking, like, how did that even get published? Who approved that?
Yeah, it's jarring.
And the real kicker here, the thing that really gets you, is that it's the fourth time this quarter you've seen something slip through the cracks like that.
Which is a huge red flag.
Exactly. And the immediate reaction across the organization is, usually to just blame the creative team. Like, someone was sloppy.
Or someone just didn't read the PDF.
Right. But the stack of enterprise architecture notes and the research briefs we're diving into today for this deep dive, they paint a much darker picture.
A much more systemic picture, really.
Yeah. The creatives aren't just sloppy, they are fundamentally burnt out. They're drowning in this impossible volume of guidelines and compliance mandates.
And personalization variants.
Yeah.
It's just no human brain can physically track it anymore.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is our mission for today. We are taking a really hard look at why traditional brand governance is just completely failing to deliver consistent experiences at scale.
It really is breaking down.
And more importantly, we're exploring the solutions, right? The architectural solutions stepping into this void. Specifically, we're looking at this radical new human-AI partnership model.
The proactive guardrails.
Yes, heavily focusing on the proactive guardrails being engineered into platforms like Adobe Experience Platform or AEP. We're dissecting how this software is attempting to fix a supply chain that is, frankly, on fire.
Yeah, to really understand the solution, we have to forensically examine the failure of the old model first.
Makes sense. Where do we start?
Well, when we look at that off-brand banner in your scenario, pointing a finger at the designer that's just addressing a symptom.
Right, it's not the actual disease.
Exactly. The underlying disease is cognitive overload. Let's look at the actual math of what an enterprise creative is holding in their working memory right now.
It's a lot, I imagine.
It's staggering. I mean, 15 years ago, brand governance was pretty static. It was like a 20-page PDF sitting on a shared server.
Right. It had your logo, lockups, your primary colors.
Maybe a secondary color palette and typographic hierarchy. And that was it.
Right. A totally closed system. You learn the 20 pages and you just apply them to the 3 or 4 major monolithic campaigns you run that year.
Exactly. But today,
yeah,
that system is this sprawling, multi-dimensional matrix.
Matrix is a good word for it.
You have the core brand identity, sure, but then you fragment that into sub-brands, each with their own distinct visual language.
And then you fracture it again by platform, right?
Right, because the stylistic requirements for, say, a 60-second YouTube pre-roll, those are fundamentally opposed to the requirements for a native TikTok integration.
Or like a B2B LinkedIn carousel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yet they all somehow have to retain a unified brand architecture.
And if it were just visual guidelines, maybe a highly disciplined team could manage it. But we're layering on regional compliance laws now.
Oh, the compliance aspect is huge.
Like, if you're a global financial institution, the legal disclaimers for banner ad in California are entirely different from the ones required in the European Union under GDPR.
Or in the UK under the FCA.
Right. And then you have accessibility requirements on top of that.
Yeah, the WK compliance for contrast ratios, screen reader compatibility.
The quarterly campaign messaging shifts. It's absurd.
When you compound all of those variables, you're demanding that human beings, people who are hired for their lateral thinking and emotional intelligence, mind you.
Right, artists, basically.
You're asking them to function as encyclopedic, real-time compliance engines.
Which is just not how our brains work.
It's mathematically impossible to scale. And this is happening at the exact moment that enterprise personalization engines are demanding exponentially more content.
We aren't making 3 campaigns a year anymore.
No, we are dynamically generating 10,000 micro-touch points a day just to feed the beast.
It's like, okay, think of it this way. It's like assigning a human editor to manually proofread every single drop of water coming out of a commercial fire hose before it hits the pavement.
That is exactly what it feels like.
It's an unwinnable game of volume versus human attention span. The person holding the hose is going to get exhausted.
And that's when they start missing the subtle deviations.
Right. And more importantly, if they're spending like 80% of their cognitive energy just checking compliance boxes, they're only spending 20% of their time actually designing.
Or writing, which directly impacts market performance. The review cycles just become these punishing multi-departmental gauntlets.
Oh, I've seen those gauntlets.
A designer submits an asset, it goes to the brand team who flags the tone. So the designer revises it.
Then it goes to legal.
Right, and legal flags a compliance risk in the new copy. So it goes back to the designer again.
By the fourth revision, the creative team just stops taking risks entirely.
Exactly. They stop trying to innovate or capture attention, and they just default to producing the most sterile, frictionless asset possible.
Just to survive the approval matrix, I want you, listening to this deep dive right now, to think about the workflow bottlenecks in your own organization.
It's a universal experience.
We all know the feeling of a JIRA ticket or a workfront task that just bounces endlessly between in review and changes requested.
The goalposts just keep moving.
Because the rules are too complex for any one department to hold simultaneously. So if the manual fire hose approach is a mathematical dead end, the architecture has to fundamentally pivot.
Right. The platform itself has to absorb the compliance burden.
And according to the architectural analyses we're looking at today, the paradigm shift is moving from reactive moderation to proactive enforcement.
Largely driven by AEP's new frameworks.
Right. So let's talk about AEP. The distinction between reactive and proactive, that seems to be the crux of the entire technological leap here.
It is. The broken system we just described, that's entirely reactive.
You make the thing, then someone tells you it's wrong.
Exactly. The asset is rendered, the labor is expended, and then someone reacts to it with a red pen. AEP is deploying an architecture built around proactive brand guardrails.
Driven by their agent orchestrator, right?
Yes. So if we look at the data flow here, these specialized AI agents aren't just sitting at the end of the assembly line acting as a final spell check.
So they're integrated earlier in the process.
Much earlier. They're integrated into the actual brief and creation environment. The agent intercepts the marketing brief from the project management software.
Like Workfront.
Exactly. It parses the requirements and applies that whole complex matrix of brand guidelines before the designer even opens the canvas.
Wait, really? So the integration happens at the very inception point?
Yes. The AI agents are analyzing the intent of the campaign. So, if a marketer inputs a brief for a new promotional email targeting a specific European demographic road,
The agent just immediately steps in.
it immediately cross-references the regional compliance database, the current brand visual identity for that sub-brand, and the platform specifications.
And it flags inherent contradictions pre-production.
Exactly. Before a single pixel is placed.
Meaning, if the brief asks for a visual aesthetic that, I don't know, inherently violates an accessibility contrast ratio or suggests copy that trips a European regulatory wire,
The agent catches it at the text input phase.
that's wild. And from what I see in the documentation here, it doesn't just block the action, it suggests the mathematically closest on-brand alternative.
Right. It acts as a real-time co-pilot during the actual rendering process.
So by embedding the compliance engine directly into the creation environment, you just drastically collapse those soul-crushing review cycles we were talking about.
Because the human creative isn't guessing what will pass legal anymore. The system structurally prevents them from generating something that fails the baseline criteria.
But wait, let me push back on this a little bit. If we look at the reality of enterprise branding, a brand isn't just a spreadsheet of hex codes and typography weights, right?
No, it's much more than that.
A brand is a highly subjective vibe. It's an attitude. Like, it's the subtle difference between a luxury automotive brand using moody, understated lighting versus a direct-to-consumer lifestyle brand using energetic, high-contrast sunlight.
Absolutely.
So if we're relying on an AI agent to proactively enforce the rules, how does an algorithmic system actually understand something as abstract as a vibe without just turning the output into a rigid robotic template?
That is a great question. And it's the exact threshold that separates generic, consumer-grade generative AI from true enterprise-grade architecture.
Okay, break that down for me.
Well, if you prompt an open-source model, just a public AI, to generate an image of a luxury watch campaign, it relies on a statistical average of its broad training data.
Right. It gives you a generic rendering of what the whole internet thinks luxury looks like.
Exactly. It's average. But AEP bypasses this entirely through an architecture called the content intelligence layer.
And that relies heavily on semantic grounding, right, within their Firefly models.
Yes, semantic grounding is the key here.
Let's really pull apart the mechanics of semantic grounding because, you see the term thrown around in marketing copy a lot, but functionally, we're talking about high-dimensional vector space here.
We are. We're talking about mapping meaning, not just pixels.
So how does an enterprise actually ground a model semantically?
They integrate their entire historical digital asset management system, their DAM, into the training environment of a custom Firefly model.
Wait, the entire dam?
Everything. We're talking about ingesting 10, maybe 15 years of approved assets, successful campaign templates, rejected drafts, and explicit brand guidelines.
So the system isn't just looking at the final JPEGs.
No, it is analyzing the metadata, the layer structures in the design files, the copy syntax, everything.
It's like, okay, tell me if this analogy works. It's like handing a jazz musician the sheet music for every song a specific band has ever played.
That's a great way to think about it.
But not just the sheet music.
Yeah.
You give them the audio recordings, the alternate takes, the conductor's notes.
Right.
So the musician isn't just memorizing the notes. They're internalizing the specific rhythm, the swing, the precise way the bassist drags the tempo.
Exactly. And once they internalize that underlying structure, they can improvise entirely new music that still sounds unmistakably like that specific band.
So how does the AI actually do that mathematically?
The mechanism operates by assigning mathematical weights to those subtle design choices. Through that content intelligence layer, the AI maps the relationships between variables.
Give me an example of what that looks like in practice.
So it learns that for a specific enterprise, when the word innovation is used in the copy, the accompanying visual assets historically feature a specific cool color temperature.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and a minimalist compositional balance, and a sans serif typeface with tight tracking.
So the subjective vibe is quite literally translated into a complex mathematical vector.
Yes. The system understands the proprietary truth of the brand because its baseline reality is built exclusively from the brand's own historical data.
That makes a lot of sense. And because the generative model is anchored in that semantic reality, the output is inherently on brand from the first pixel.
Exactly. When the content production agent is tasked with generating 30 variations of a banner, it isn't guessing what the enterprise's aesthetic is.
It's mathematically confined to the established vector space of the brand's unique identity.
You got it.
But producing content at that scale, even if it is perfectly semantically grounded and totally compliant, it introduces a terrifying new problem, doesn't it?
It does shift the bottleneck, yes.
Right. We've solved the creation bottleneck.
Yeah.
We can generate 1 million customized on-brand banners a minute. But creation in a vacuum is essentially just useless overhead.
Right. If it doesn't perform, what's the point?
Exactly. How does an enterprise know if any of those 1 million banners are actually moving the needle? Or driving conversions, or resonating with the market? If we're flooding the zone with variations, the analytics bottleneck becomes the new point of failure.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
I love that phrase. Lay it on me.
This is where the architecture transitions from just being a creation engine into a closed-loop ecosystem.
Okay.
The research details a component called Gen Studio, which integrates directly with AEP to build an AI-driven content performance feedback loop.
So it's not just making the asset.
No. The system doesn't just generate the asset and throw it over the wall to the activation platform. It tracks the performance telemetry of that specific asset out in the wild.
And we aren't just talking about traditional A/B testing here, right?
Yeah.
Because traditional analytics gives you macroscopic data.
Right. Ad A versus ad B.
Yeah, you run ad A and ad B. Ad A gets a 3% click-through rate. Ad B gets a 1%. The human analyst concludes ad A is the winner and reallocates the budget.
But traditional analytics rarely tells you the precise mechanism of why ad A won.
Exactly. Was it the subject matter of the photo? Was it the call to action placement? Was it like the specific shade of blue in the background?
The limitation of human analysis is granularity. The AEP framework deploys what the architecture notes refer to as attribute-level analysis.
Attribute-level analysis. What does that mean in practice?
It means when the semantic grounding layer creates an asset, it tags every single micro-component of that asset as a distinct variable.
So it isolates the specific hue and saturation values.
Yes, and the pacing of the video edits.
The exact syntactical structure of the headline, like whether it uses an imperative verb or a passive question.
Right, the depth of field and the photography, the sentiment score, the copy, everything.
So it breaks the campaign down into thousands of trackable attributes.
Honestly. And when the performance telemetry comes back from the activation layer, say, from Adobe Journey, Optimizer, the AI, maps the conversion data against that massive matrix of attributes.
Identifying patterns that a human could never see.
It identifies microscopic patterns across hundreds of thousands of interactions.
For instance,
It might discover that across 50 different campaign variants, The highest engagement rates among a specific demographic in the Pacific Northwest occurred when the visual assets featured a shallow depth of field, a muted color palette, and copy that utilized a specific interrogative structure.
That is mind-blowing. The AI is literally reverse engineering the psychology of the audience based on the mathematical performance of the design attributes.
It is. But the truly disruptive part of this loop isn't just the analysis.
Oh.
It's the automation of the subsequent action. Think about a traditional workflow. That granular data gets exported into a dashboard, right?
Yeah, and a data scientist spends 3 weeks interpreting it, writes a report, and hands it to the creative director.
Who then tries to manually incorporate those learnings into the next quarter's campaign brief.
Right, and by the time the human workflow incorporates the data, the market conditions have probably already shifted.
Exactly. But in the closed-loop architecture, that attribute-level performance data feeds directly back into the semantic grounding layer of the generative AI.
So the system feeds itself.
It is continuous, autonomous optimization. The AI learns that the shallow depth of field and muted palette are currently outperforming the baseline for that specific audience segment.
So the next time the agent orchestrator receives a brief targeting that segment, it automatically adjusts the mathematical weights in the Firefly model.
Yes, the next batch of generated assets will organically lean into those winning attributes.
The content supply chain basically becomes a living organism. It evolves its aesthetic and messaging based on real-time micro-performance telemetry.
That's exactly what's happening.
Which brings us to the operational complexity of actually running a system like this. Because if we have AI generating the visuals, analyzing the telemetry, and dynamically updating its own training weights, who or what is managing the flow of data between all these massive enterprise nodes?
Right, the orchestration layer.
We touched on the agent orchestrator earlier, but we really need to dive deep into the mechanics of agentic AI, because this represents a fundamental departure from how most people interact with AI today.
It really does. The public perception of AI is largely anchored in prompt-based interactions.
Yeah, you open a chat interface, you type a specific instruction, and the large language model outputs a static response.
Right. It's a single-turn reactive process. Agentic AI, which is the backbone of the AEP workflow orchestration, is structurally different.
How so?
We're talking about autonomous software entities equipped with specific tools, given access to specific enterprise APIs, and tasked with achieving complex, multi-step goals.
Okay, let's build out a concrete architectural scenario to visualize how these agents interact across the supply chain, because it sounds a bit abstract.
Good idea. Let's say a global athletic apparel brand is launching a new running shoe across 40 different regional markets.
Okay, 40 markets. In the manual paradigm, a human project manager creates a master ticket in a system like Workfront.
Yep. They assign human designers to create the core visual assets. They manually route those assets to 40 different localization agencies for translation.
They route the translations to regional legal teams. They collect the approved files, format them for different social platforms, upload them into a DAM, and finally hand them to the media buyers.
It is a logistical nightmare characterized by immense friction and latency at every single handoff point.
So how does an agentic workflow handle that same sneaker launch?
In an agentic workflow, that entire process is orchestrated by specialized AI agents communicating autonomously with each other.
So the human strategist just inputs the initial campaign parameters and the core product imagery into Workfront.
Exactly. And the workflow optimization agent detects the new project and assumes control of the routing.
Okay, so the workflow agent parses the requirements and makes an API call to the content production agent. It passes the core imagery and the parameters for the 40 required region.
Right. Then the content production agent interfaces with the semantically grounded Firefly model.
Generating the localized visual variants.
Yes. Adjusting the background environments to reflect the specific regions, ensuring the brand guidelines are strictly enforced.
And once the visual variants are rendered, what happens next?
The content production agent triggers parallel API calls to localization services to adapt the core copy into 40 languages, adjusting the syntax for regional nuance and sentiment.
But here is where the multi-agent collaboration becomes really critical, right? The content production agent doesn't just blindly approve those translations.
No, it hands them off to a compliance agent.
Okay, so the compliance agent cross-references the 40 localized assets against the regional regulatory databases.
Right. And let's say it scans the German asset and detects that a specific translated phrase edges just a little too close to a restricted claim under local advertising laws.
What happens? Does the whole global launch crash?
No, that's the beauty of it. The agent flags that specific asset, but it doesn't halt the entire launch. It routes the flagged German asset via AEM Adobe Experience Manager directly to the queue of a human legal reviewer in Frankfurt for manual adjudication.
While simultaneously pushing the 39 approved assets forward to the journey optimizer for staging.
Exactly. The agents are executing complex logic branching, managing exceptions, and integrating seamlessly across third-party ecosystems and proprietary data lakes.
So they're managing the supply chain from the planning node through creation, asset management, all the way to activation with minimal human intervention.
Outside of explicitly defined escalation paths, yes.
Now, I have to play the role of the chief risk officer for a second here.
Go for it.
Listening to this architecture and ecosystem where autonomous software agents are generating massive volumes of content, translating it, pushing it live based on continuous feedback loops, it sounds like an absolute existential legal nightmare for a Fortune 500 company.
Oh, I'm sure it terrifies them.
The IP of an enterprise is its most tightly guarded asset. The thought of an AI model hallucinating a trademarked character that belongs to a competitor or ingesting copyrighted material from the open internet and baking it into a global campaign, that's enough to keep corporate lawyers awake for weeks.
Absolute.
So how does a massive enterprise justify the risk of deploying this architecture?
What's fascinating here is that the integration of generative AI into the enterprise hinges entirely on the mitigation of that specific legal exposure.
Right. Platforms like AEP aren't just selling a creative engine, they are selling a heavily fortified corporate shield.
Exactly. The architecture is explicitly designed to isolate the enterprise from the inherent risks of open source models.
And the primary mechanism for that isolation is the walled garden of the custom model.
Yes, we established that the semantic grounding relies on the enterprise's proprietary DAM. The critical legal distinction here is that the training data is hermetically sealed.
So the custom Firefly model is not continually scraping the open internet.
No, it is not updating its weights based on unvetted public data sets where copyright ownership is ambiguous or highly contested.
It trains exclusively on the approved, legally cleared assets provided by the enterprise.
Right. The model learns the unique product designs, the proprietary characters, and the specific campaign styles without ever exposing itself to external IP.
This structural isolation drastically reduces the probability of the model generating infringing material.
But AEP extends the corporate shield beyond just architectural isolation. They offer explicit legal backing.
Right. This is the mechanism that actually moves the needle in the boardroom. Wow. IP indemnity.
Yes. For assets generated through these commercially safe workflows, Adobe provides intellectual property indemnity to the enterprise.
Which means in the highly unlikely event that the semantically grounded, walled-off AI generates an asset that inadvertently infringes on an external copyright and a third party pursues legal action.
Adobe assumes the legal liability.
Wow! They foot the legal bill and cover the damages.
You do. And that fundamentally alters the risk calculus for the chief risk officer. It transforms generative AI from a terrifying, unquantifiable liability into a legally defended business utility.
But mitigating external copyright risk is only one vector of the corporate shield, right? The architecture also has to account for reputational risk. If an autonomous agent pushes out a campaign that is tone-deaf, culturally insensitive, or structurally biased, the damage to the brand equity can be catastrophic, regardless of copyright law.
Right, which necessitates the integration of an ethical AI framework directly into the governance architecture.
And the research emphasizes that responsible AI principles, specifically accountability, responsibility, and transparency, cannot be retroactive patches.
No, they must be embedded in the foundational code of the platform. In AEP, this manifests through rigid data governance protocols.
A core component of that protocol is the deployment of data usage labels, or DULs.
Yes, DULs are critical.
Explain how DULs work for the listener.
Well, every single piece of data, every customer profile, every historical asset ingested into the AEP ecosystem is appended with specific immutable metadata tags.
And these labels dictate precisely how that specific node of data can be utilized by the machine learning models.
Exactly. So if an enterprise ingests a database of customer interactions, but a specific subset of those customers has opted out of having their data used for automated profiling or generative modeling,
the DULs structurally prevent the AI from accessing that subset during the training or generation phases.
yes, the system enforces consent policies at the architectural level. ensuring that the multi-agent workflows cannot inadvertently violate data privacy regulations like GDPR or CCPA.
That's a huge failsafe. Furthermore, the governance framework mandates continuous automated bias testing, doesn't it?
It has to. Because left to their own devices, machine learning models will ruthlessly optimize for engagement.
Which often means amplifying the historical biases present in their training data.
Exactly. If a brand's historical campaigns heavily featured a specific demographic, the semantic grounding might assume the demographic is a required attribute for success, inadvertently excluding others in future generations.
So the architecture requires mechanisms that constantly evaluate the outputs against established fairness metrics.
Forcing the model to generate representative and ethically sound variations, even if they slightly deviate from historical statistical averages.
Okay, so we've outlined a staggeringly complex, highly automated architecture. We have autonomous agents orchestrating the supply chain, semantically grounded models generating compliant variations at scale, closed-loop analytics driving continuous optimization, and an ironclad legal and ethical framework shielding the enterprise from risk.
It is remarkably robust technology.
But we really have to examine the second-order effects of this deployment, because if the software is absorbing the project management, the compliance review, and the iteration cycles, we're looking at a fundamental restructuring of the human workforce within the enterprise.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the human element doesn't disappear, but the nature of the labor radically shifts.
Right. Let's look at the traditional creative director. Historically, this role has been the ultimate arbiter of taste, sitting at the end of the fire hose, manually reviewing assets, tweaking typography, and policing the brand guidelines.
It is a role heavily bogged down in iterative execution.
But as the architecture assumes responsibility for that iterative execution, the role evolves into what the research defines as the AI curator and strategist.
Right. The creative director is no longer pushing pixels or babysitting the alignment of the logo. Their primary function shifts upstream.
Upstream to the configuration of the semantic grounding.
Exactly. They are the human intelligence defining the intricate, high-dimensional vectors of the brand identity. They are determining what data goes into the custom model and adjusting the mathematical weights of the vibe we discussed earlier.
So they transition from managing the output of human designers to managing the parameters of the AI engine.
Yes. And on the other end of the workflow, their role shifts to curation.
Right, because when the content production agent generates 100 highly polished, perfectly compliant variations of a campaign, the strategist reviews the options not for baseline quality, but for strategic resonance.
They are the human emotional filter, selecting the specific asset that captures the precise cultural nuance required for that moment. They handle the strategy, and the architecture handles the execution.
And this upstream shift by the creative leadership enables a massive downstream democratization of content creation, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
In the manual paradigm, the ability to generate on-brand assets was heavily siloed within the specialized creative department.
Yeah. If a regional marketing manager needed a highly specific, localized banner for a micro-campaign, they had to submit a ticket and wait for the creative team to process it through the bottleneck.
But with the integration of AI assistants directly into the workflow interfaces, that specialized skill barrier is completely removed.
The marketing manager doesn't need to understand the complexities of Adobe Illustrator or the nuances of the brand's typography hierarchy. They can just input a natural language prompt defining their strategic goal, and the semantically grounded Firefly model generates the asset instantly.
And because the proactive guardrails are hard-coded into the system, the enterprise trusts that whatever the marketing manager generates will be legally and stylistically compliant.
The architecture empowers the personnel closest to the market data to execute their own creative strategies autonomously.
But, and this is a big case, but an ecosystem of democratized creators and autonomous agents requires a new kind of oversight.
Which necessitates the creation of an entirely new discipline outlined in the sources, the content supply chain architect.
Yes. This is a fascinating role because it sits right at the intersection of creative strategy, data engineering, and systems architecture.
The supply chain architect isn't designing the campaigns, and they aren't writing the copy. They're designing the plumbing.
Exactly. They are responsible for building and optimizing the complex data pipelines that connect the disparate nodes of the enterprise.
Ensuring that the API handshake between the planning software and the generation model is seamless.
Right. And they monitor the performance feedback loops, ensuring that the attribute-level telemetry from the Journey Optimizer is correctly formatted and routed back into the Firefly training environment.
They are the master builders of the automated workflows, constantly tweaking the logic thresholds of the compliance agents to balance risk mitigation with operational velocity.
It paints a picture of a highly efficient, frictionless utopia, doesn't it?
It really does. The content flows seamlessly, the brand is perfectly maintained, the analytics automatically optimize the output, and the workforce is elevated to high-level strategic roles.
But any systems architect knows that utopia is an illusion.
Right. When you deploy an infrastructure of this scale and complexity, the failure modes become equally complex and exponentially more damaging.
We need to walk through the war room scenarios, the specific systemic vulnerabilities that this architecture introduces.
Let's do it, because I think anyone listening is probably wondering what happens when this complex machinery breaks down.
Well, the primary vulnerability of any machine learning system is the integrity of its data. So the first failure mode the research identifies is brand guideline drift.
Brand guideline drift, that sounds insidious.
It is insidious because it doesn't trigger an immediate alert. It is a slow, structural degradation caused by contaminated training data.
Let's trace the mechanism of drift. We established that the custom Firefly model relies on the enterprise dam for semantic grounding. But the dam is only as pure as the human curation behind it.
Exactly. Imagine the AI curator accidentally includes a batch of assets from a legacy campaign that utilize a slightly off-brand typography.
Or perhaps a localized campaign that subtly deviated from the core color palette to appeal to a specific market.
Right. The model ingests those deviations and incorporates them into its vector space. It assigns a mathematical weight to that off-brand typography.
And over millions of iterations, as the system continually feeds on its own generated output and performance data, that slight deviation becomes amplified.
Yes. The AI begins to regularly deploy the incorrect font. The reds drift slightly towards orange. The syntactical structure becomes slightly too casual.
And because the shift is microscopic from generation to generation, it bypasses the human curation filters.
And by the time leadership recognizes the drift, the fundamental aesthetic of the brand has been altered at scale, requiring a massive, systemic retraining of the underlying models.
Wow. And while drift is a slow burn, the second failure mode is an immediate catastrophic event, right? Hallucinated messaging.
Yes, hallucinations. We understand that large language models process text probabilistically. They predict the next most likely word based on their training weights.
But in highly regulated environments, probability is not an acceptable substitute for accuracy.
Not at all. Consider the pharmaceutical architecture, for example.
Okay.
An AI assistant is tasked with generating localized copy for a new cardiovascular medication. The semantic grounding is tight, the guardrails are up. But if the specific compliance database containing the newly updated FDA disclaimers experiences an API failure,
Or if the agent's logic thresholds are misconfigured.
exactly, the model might attempt to fill the knowledge gap by hallucinating. It reverts to the broader statistical averages of its foundational training, inventing medical claims or omitting critical side effect warnings, because the generated text just sounds linguistically persuasive.
And if that hallucinated copy bypasses the automated compliance checks and goes live, the enterprise isn't just dealing with an off-brand banner.
No, they are facing massive federal regulatory fines, product recalls, and severe reputational damage.
So the proactive guardrails have to be structurally infallible, which is an engineering impossibility.
Which brings us to a failure mode that is less about legal risk and more about existential brand survival. Brand fatigue.
Brand fatigue. This is the inherent danger of a perfectly optimized closed-loop ecosystem, isn't it?
Yes. If the attribute-level analytics constantly feed back into the generation model, ruthless optimization takes over.
The system identifies that a highly specific compositional layout featuring a specific color temperature and a specific syntactical hook yields a 0.2% increase in engagement.
And the model organically begins to skew all generated content toward that mathematical optimum.
But when you optimize purely for immediate conversion metrics, the system aggressively regresses to the mean. It smooths out all the jagged, interesting, slightly challenging edges of the brand's identity.
It produces the most statistically acceptable, mathematically frictionless content possible.
And when every enterprise in a given sector is deploying similar optimization architectures, the consumer market is flooded with a sea of sameness. Every financial ad looks identical. Every automotive campaign sounds the same.
The consumer develops profound banner blindness. The content is mathematically perfect, but emotionally bankrupt.
The brand loses its soul, which ironically destroys the long-term engagement the system was built to maximize.
This failure mode highlights exactly why the human AI curator must constantly inject strategic disruption into the system, intentionally overriding the analytics to maintain the brand's unique edge.
Okay, finally, we have to address the most common and immediate vulnerability, which completely bypasses the complex architecture we just spent the last hour dissecting.
Shadow AI.
Shadow AI. This is the human element subverting the system. We established the massive legal shield of the custom semantically grounded Firefly models, but that shield only works if the workforce actually uses the designated tools.
Exactly. Imagine a scenario where a localized marketing team is under a tight deadline. The enterprise AEP system is currently undergoing a model update and is temporarily sluggish.
Right, so instead of waiting, an individual creative simply opens a new tab, navigates to an open source, non-governed generative AI tool, and types a prompt.
They generate an asset, download the JPEG, and manually upload it into the activation pipeline, completely bypassing the agent orchestrator, the compliance checks, and the semantic grounding.
In 5 seconds, that individual has reintroduced the entire spectrum of enterprise risk. The organization has no idea what data that open source model was trained on. They have no IP indemnity.
The asset might contain deeply embedded copyright infringements or subtle biases, and the unvetted asset enters the enterprise dam, poisoning the well for future semantic training.
The most sophisticated, legally fortified architecture in the world is instantly compromised by a human seeking a shortcut.
It is the ultimate paradox of enterprise automation. The more complex and automated the architectural systems become, the more fragile they are to human circumvention or poor human input.
The integrity of the machine is entirely dependent on the discipline of the operator,
Exactly.
which provides the perfect transition into the most uncomfortable, controversial realization buried in this stack of architectural analysis.
This is the big one.
So, what does this all mean? We have built this entire discussion around the concept of a human-AI partnership. We've framed the human as the strategic curator, the emotional filter, the master architect of the system. But the documentation suggests a much starker reality regarding why humans remain in the loop at all.
It forces us to confront the actual capabilities of the technology versus the artificial constraints placed upon it by society.
Right. We established that manual human review is the primary bottleneck. We also established that the AI, operating within a semantically grounded closed-loop architecture, is fundamentally faster, more mathematically consistent, and more analytically precise than a human creative director.
So this raises an important question.
If the AI is superior at enforcing the guidelines, analyzing the telemetry, and generating the optimal variations, why doesn't the enterprise just remove the human entirely?
Why not let the agent orchestrator run the entire supply chain autonomously, from inception to activation?
Right. The standard corporate narrative is that the AI lacks a human touch, that it needs a human to refine the art and inject soul. But the research points to a much more cynical, pragmatic truth.
The human in the loop is no longer primarily there to refine the creative output. The AI does not strictly need the human to make the asset better. The uncomfortable truth is that human oversight has been fundamentally repurposed as a necessary legal and ethical liability shield.
A human is a shock absorber for corporate risk.
Yes. Let's unpack the mechanics of this liability shield, because it is rooted in the current state of global regulatory frameworks. Enterprises are compelled to maintain human approval gates even when those gates throttle the efficiency of the AI because the legal systems we operate within demand a defensible human signature on corporate actions.
Right. Look at current intellectual property law. The U.S. Copyright Office and many international equivalents have established precedents that works generated purely autonomously by artificial intelligence without significant human authorship cannot be copyrighted.
And for an enterprise, content that cannot be copyrighted is essentially worthless, as it cannot be legally protected from competitor duplication.
Therefore, the human remains in the loop not necessarily to improve the kerning on the font, but to apply enough manual adjustment or to actively curate the generation prompts to legally claim authorship.
The human is there to secure the copyright.
Wow.
Furthermore, in the context of liability, corporate governance requires accountability. If the autonomous architecture hallucinates a non-compliant medical claim or generates a culturally offensive campaign that severely damages the brand equity, the corporate board, the shareholders, and the regulatory bodies demand a point of accountability.
Because you cannot fire an algorithm, you cannot sue a vector space.
Exactly. The enterprise needs a human name on the approval log. They need to be able to point to the workflow metadata and say, the AI generated the options, but John Smith, the regional marketing director, reviewed the asset, approved it, and pushed it live. the liability rests with John Smith.
The human is retained in the workflow to take the fall when the system inevitably encounters a failure mode.
It completely recontextualizes the dynamic. We are not partnering with the AI to elevate human creativity. The enterprise is shackling the AI to human risk-averse behavior to absorb legal liability.
And the architectural consequence of this reality is severe. This liability shield requirement is fundamentally throttling the true potential of the technology.
It is.
The architecture we explored today, the agentic workflows, the closed-loop telemetry, the real-time semantic adjustments it's capable of operating at light speed. It could dynamically generate and test millions of personalized micro-campaigns a day, reacting to market shifts in milliseconds.
But it is artificially constrained.
It's forced to operate at the speed of a human lawyer reviewing a PDF or a risk-averse brand manager manually clicking approve in a dashboard. The technological capability of the software has vastly outpaced the legal and societal frameworks required to fully unleash it.
We have engineered an infrastructure capable of autonomous, hyperscaled communication, but we are holding it back because our legal structures cannot process liability without a human scapegoat.
It is a profound realization to end on. We have covered immense ground in this analysis today.
We really have.
We started by dissecting the collapse of the manual review process, where the sheer volume of compliance and personalization demands literally broke the cognitive capacity of the creative workforce.
Then we examined the architectural response. Platforms like AEP shifting from reactive moderation to proactive guardrails.
We explored the mechanics of semantic grounding, detailing how enterprise dams are converted into high-dimensional vector spaces to teach AI the mathematical structure of a brand's unique vibe.
We track the data flow of the closed-loop system, where attribute-level analytics feed continuous autonomous optimization.
We mapped the intricate multi-agent workflows orchestrated by agentic AI and examined the critical corporate shields, the IP indemnity, and embedded ethical frameworks that make deployment viable.
We discussed the reshaping of the workforce, the rise of the AI curator, and the content supply chain architect. And we confronted the systemic vulnerabilities of the architecture, the slow creep of brand guideline drift, the catastrophic risk of hallucinations, the sea of sameness caused by optimization fatigue, and the ever-present threat of shadow AI.
Which brought us to the final, sobering truth of the human liability shield. And as we close this deep dive, I want you to consider the trajectory of this architecture. We have established that human involvement is increasingly maintained merely as a legal requirement, a defensible signature to absorb risk, fundamentally breaking the speed of the AI.
Right.
So look at the historical arc of technological regulation. It is inherently reactive. How long will it take for the regulatory landscape, the copyright offices, and the liability frameworks to catch up to the reality of autonomous generation?
That is the million-dollar question.
Will there come a day, and it might be much sooner than the market anticipates, when the concept of a defensible human signature on an enterprise asset is considered legally obsolete? And if that legal barrier dissolves and the enterprise finally removes the human bottleneck to let the agentic architecture run at full, unconstrained capacity, who ultimately takes the fall when the system inevitably goes rogue?
It is the defining architectural and ethical question for every enterprise leader looking at this technology today.
Until next time, keep questioning the process and stay curious.